Hello and welcome. What if Latin America ruled the world? Well, it may sound crazy, but for some it's becoming a reality as countries from South to Central America start to exert their influence on the global stage. Traditionally considered as the USA's backyard, these nations have largely either suffered or benefited from US policies directed at them. Now countries such as Brazil, Venezuela, Bolivia and Mexico have shown they have a voice to add to international affairs. This rise in prominence has come from a combination of economic development and political mobilization that has allowed them to set their own path. On today's show, what about the other America? Has the USA lost its grip on its neighbors to the south? You can join the conversation with your questions and comments, send an SMS or an email, and we'll also take your phone calls on the show. Joining me now from London is Oscar Guardiola-Rivera, that's lecturer of international law and international affairs at Birkbeck College at the University of London. Previously, he served as an aide in the Colombian Congress and founded a think tank focusing on human rights. As I mentioned, he's the author of What If Latin America Ruled the World? How the South Will Take the North into the 22nd Century, which is creating a bit of a stir. Sebastian Edwards is with us too, the Henry Ford Professor of International Business Economics at UCLA. Previously, he was the World Bank's chief economist for Latin America. He's the author of many books, the most recent being Left Behind, Latin America and the False Promise of Populism. Gentlemen, I welcome you both to the show, and Mr. Guardiola-Rivera, let me ask you first, how exactly do you think the South will take the North into the 22nd century?
Well, Riz, let me just say first that it is a pleasure to be here. In fact, it's a combination of three elements. First of all, the countries of Latin America have turned their back on economic and political dogma, both left and right, and are creating a middle way between pragmatism and political principles, mainly in favor of social justice and redistribution, and also connecting more strongly with grassroots movements. It is this particular connection between grassroots movements and governments which is creating a space that is allowing the countries of Latin America a hard-gained autonomy and maturity in its relations with both the US and the rest of the world.
Okay, well, Sebastian Edwards, you clearly see the populism of Latin America as a path to failure. Why is that?
Well, first of all, let me start by saying that it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
The first thing I believe that we have to recognize is that it's really hard to talk about Latin America as one consistent and coherent group of countries. There are 19 nations. They go from very poor, tiny nations like Haiti all the way to giants like Brazil. So we have to be a little bit careful when we talk about Latin America. Now, within Latin America, we have seen in the past few years a handful of countries, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and others, that have taken what I call in my new book a populist path. And we have seen many of these type of experiments in the past. And unfortunately for the people in these countries, they lead to high inflation, declined growth, low employment, and eventually economic crisis. And I think that those countries are moving in that direction, and I'm quite concerned about them. There are other nations in Latin America that are doing quite well, and we can talk about them: Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Costa Rica, and others.
Of course, Professor Edwards, you make a very valid point about the grouping of countries, and that's something I was going to raise, whether or not we can think of Latin America as one big mass. But when it does come to those countries you mentioned just now, such as Brazil, they are beginning to stand out fairly strongly on the world stage. So presumably they're doing something right.
Oh, absolutely. Brazil in particular has been doing almost everything right. And the most important thing that they did, and the President Lula is of course to be commended for this, is that they brought down inflation. Inflation is the enemy of the poor. Inflation is the enemy of credit markets. And Brazil had had inflations in the 1,000% per year, which for us people in the West, in the advanced countries, is very, very hard to even fathom. And by getting rid of inflation, what President Lula has done is that it has opened up the credit markets to the poor. And now we are seeing that the lower middle class in Brazil and even the poor can access a number of goods that were in the past just the privilege of those that were fortunate and were in the upper classes. So we have a country with almost 200 million people moving in the right direction, and we are all very excited about that. But what is very important is that Lula, President Lula, has taken a position in economics that it's almost exactly the opposite to what, say, Hugo Chavez has done in Venezuela. And we have to make a distinction.
All right. Well, Oscar Guardiola-Rivera, let me get you back in here and ask you, based on a quote from your book here, and I'm going to quote your book, What If Latin America Ruled the World? After having witnessed South American countries fare better than most during the Great Recession, the rest of the world seems ready to listen. Indeed, Latin America no longer specializes in losing. Now, I know that you talk of Latin America going through a renaissance, a Latin American renaissance, and also a reformation in the time of globalization, you say. On what scale do you see that change occurring?
The scale is historical. What is happening in Latin America is tantamount to an opening of paths. In fact, I would like to say two things. First of all, one can speak of Latin America as a unity, and what is happening today in UNASUR proves that the very existence of UNASUR, the very existence of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States proves that we have 32 out of the 35 countries in the Americas gathering together around principles of social justice, and most of all, around the struggle against inequality. It is inequality which is the real enemy of the poor. And it is precisely in the way in which President Lula, but also the government of Evo Morales has been struggling against inequality, has been returning political power to the grassroots. It is there where we can find a reformation in globalization. It isn't the case that globalization is some sort of inevitable force that is obliging all countries in the world to adopt exactly the same measures. Quite the contrary, Latin American countries such as Brazil, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, and also to a certain extent Ecuador and even Venezuela are proving that there are other ways. And the rest of the world is certainly paying attention.
Professor Sebastian Edwards, a quote from your book, Left Behind, Latin America and the False Promise of Populism. You say populist policies ultimately fail, hurting those they were supposed to favor. The global crash, paradoxically, seems likely to increase the appeal of populists precisely at the time when their policies are least likely to work. Now, the neoliberal reforms of the 1990s, the early 1990s, which call for the elimination of deficits and the lowering of trade barriers and privatization of inefficient public enterprises, held that promise of freeing Latin America from the burdens of the past. I presume you feel that that failed.
They did fail in a number of countries to some extent, and the main problem, and I think that Argentina is the premier example, is that those policies were that, as you said, looked at reforming a very inefficient economic system. Were undertaken together with the wrong type of currency policies that fixed the value of the Argentine currency, for example. And there was a huge crisis that stalled the reform halfway. So they did fail. And what we're seeing now, and I think that in that regards, I agree partially with the other guest, with Oscar, is that we're seeing a movement that is more pragmatic. But I think that we definitely have to make a distinction between the countries like Chile, Costa Rica, Brazil, Uruguay, that are looking at efficiency and productivity, and countries like Nicaragua, Venezuela, Ecuador, that are trying to take shortcuts that are definitely not working, absolutely not working. Right. And the main problem, of course, inequality is a problem, but the problem is how to deal with this. And the only real recipe is to work on the educational system, which is a real failure in Latin America, continues to be, and none of these countries of the populist group are doing anything serious about it.
Well, certainly the two of the prominent countries are Colombia and Venezuela, and of course they've started to reach a point of some point of crisis with a dispute. Let's hear the Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez here referring to that dispute.
We, Venezuela, starting at this moment, are breaking all contact with the Colombian government. Let's hope nothing serious happens in these last days that President Uribe has in the government house, because he's like crazed. And well, the gringos are pressuring him, no? The gringos are pressuring him.
Now, Oscar Guardiola-Rivera, of course, for Latin America to rule the world, it's going to have to be fairly united. Right now, it sounds like there are major rifts forming. When you look at that kind of dispute, hear what Hugo Chavez has to say, can you see the countries as a bloc working together to be a stronger force on the global stage?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, as we speak, the countries of UNASUR are getting together in order to implement a neighborly policy of diplomacy, which is going to solve this crisis without the need for U.S. intervention. Bear in mind what President Lula said yesterday about this crisis. Of course, there is a lot of rhetoric here, very incensed and vociferous rhetoric from both sides, not only from the side of the Venezuelan president, who, as we all know, is very skilled in using a certain form of rhetoric. Equally skilled is, on the other side, President Uribe. And we heard the ambassador of Colombia speaking of the Venezuelan government in fairly undiplomatic terms. But bear in mind that differences in rhetoric are not necessarily tantamount to real risks. And we will witness today a demonstration of Latin America's unity, but precisely because the Latin American countries have created spaces of their own to negotiate autonomously their differences. This is a demonstration of maturity. This is the way in which Latin America thinks it can lead the world. In fact, there isn't much difference between the leadership that Brazil is showing in solving the dispute between Colombia and Venezuela, and the skill it demonstrated when it brought Iran back to the negotiating table and obtained the 17th of May Declaration of Tehran. Okay. It is precisely this form of goodwill that allows these countries to get together and to show a different form of diplomacy to the world.
Okay, I'm going to ask you gentlemen to stand by for a second because we have to take a short break. When we come back, yet another way Latinos may rule the world is when they become the dominant political power in the United States. We'll examine that too when we return. Don't go away. Welcome back. China and India may be considered rising powers in the world, but what about Latin America? Will it actually dominate the next century? From London, we have Oscar Guardiola-Rivera, the author of the controversial new book, What If Latin America Ruled the World? How the South Will Take the North into the 22nd Century. And from Los Angeles, Sebastian Edwards is the author of Left Behind, Latin America and the False Promise of Populism. Now, before we get back to questions, let's look at the political landscape in Latin America today. In recent years, largely leftist movements have brought about ideological change and a move away from the fiscal reform of the World Bank and IMF. The result has been a local and some believe more sustainable economic program. I ask you, Oscar Guardiola-Rivera, at least that's the argument as the way you put it forward in your book. What about those who say the recent turn to economic populism has stifled economic development over the years through excessive regulation, currency manipulation, and even corruption?
Listen, to speak of populism is to use the same tired language of the 1980s and the 1990s. There is nothing wrong with the participation of the people. There is nothing wrong with grassroots social movements who have acquired maturity, such as the indigenous movement in southeastern Colombia and Ecuador or in Bolivia, actually changing the terms of leftist politics. Because that's the other point that has to be made clear here. We're not talking about the 1970s left. This is something different. Latin America has moved on, and leftism has also moved on in Latin America. Rather than having leaders and governments as the avant-garde of some unattainable utopia, social movements have acquired the maturity to understand and make their leaders understand that they must take the rear guard. There are risks here, of course, and Venezuela may be showing some of those risks. But in all the other countries which have taken this direction, it is absolutely clear that this form of governance has have very good results. And this is also the case in the global relations that these countries of Latin America are maintaining with other countries in the world.
Okay, let me bring in Professor Sebastian Edwards again and ask, is it that populism it's not necessarily a bad system, it's just been badly executed, and that's possibly the reason for your premise?
Well, it depends on what we really mean by populism. Worrying about inequality and poverty, of course, is the right thing to do. Populism, on the other hand, is a doctrine that blames inequality on the functioning of markets and tries to take shortcuts by giving the state and government-led policies too much of a role. And it has been tried before. It has been tried for the last 10 years in Venezuela, and it has been a disaster. And I think that I want to make clear, Riz, once again, the point that we cannot put all of Latin America together. UNASUR is an illusion. Mexico does not participate actively in UNASUR, doesn't participate at all. Colombia is a reluctant participant. Chile, the superstar that has been, or that was led by leftist governments of a different type, does not participate willingly in UNASUR. So I think that we have to make a distinction between one type of left, which is responsible and moving forward and is privileging efficiency and productivity, and another type of left that is the populist left that tries to take shortcuts. It has been tried before. It has never worked. It results in crisis and inflation. And we're beginning to see that in Venezuela very clearly.
Right, Professor Edwards, let me ask you one thing about the influence of the Latin American population in the US, a growing force, of course, very much in the political scene here, and many of them looking back towards their home countries or countries of origin, if you like, as some source of trade, some sort of connection, some kind of sort of home-like connection. What kind of influence do you think the Latin American population in the US will have on their neighbors to the south?
Well, tremendous influence, and we are very happy that a federal judge yesterday blocked a very important part of the Arizona immigration law that is highly discriminatory against foreigners and in particular Latinos. In the California governorship race, Latino vote is going to determine whether the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate wins the governorship. And we are seeing an increasing role of Latino politicians, and I think that that's very good for this country.
Okay.
And we'll have to see how it develops, in particular with regards to these immigration laws that are discriminatory.
Well, Joseph in New York City, thanks for your patience. What would you like to add to the conversation?
The Hispanic vote in the United States is still not as growing as fast, let's say, as the in unity as the Asiatic vote or the African American vote, where they become more unity. Unfortunately, the Hispanics, only the Mexicans and the Puerto Ricans tend to be, and the Cubans, to a degree, tends to be united.
Okay.
The rest of the Hispanics are not.
Let me ask Oscar Guardiola-Rivera about this. Our viewer Joseph makes the point that there doesn't seem to be a lot of unity or perhaps an equal play among the various nationalities in the US when it comes to being politically active.
Well, Sebastian just pointed out the way in which the anti-immigration discourse is actually unifying the coming Latino majority in the United States. If you remember, in 2006, thousands of marchers, Latinos mainly, took to the streets of the most important cities of the United States in a show of political unity. Actually, as I traveled in 2006 before those marches, I witnessed the way in which those young Latinos who helped organize in those marches then became the electoral force of organizers in the 2008 presidential elections. The Latino vote in the United States is gaining so much unity that this is the reason why both George W. Bush and also Barack Obama have tried to push through a process of immigration reform. They both know that this is the electorate of the future. And if present trends continue by 2035 or even before, by 2015, Latinos will be the majority in most states of the Union.
Okay.
And will become a decisive force in electoral politics.
Professor Sebastian Edwards, let me put two emails to you back to back we got on a similar theme from viewers. One from Maria Paz Dominguez, who wrote in to our Facebook page saying, "It's time for Latin American countries to unite. They are rich in natural resources, but they have been leashed by the US." And the second one on a similar theme from Rashid Awad in Sudan says, "Unity for Latin American nations will be the end of the US." To what degree, just a quick thought, to what degree do you think it's the fact that these countries are carving their own path that puts perhaps a little fear into the US that is losing control and influence in its in that sort of neighboring area, it, to a large degree considered its backyard?
Well, I think that the reality of things is that the U.S. for too long has really ignored Latin America. The first chapter of my book opens with the fact that when President Lula, the first left-wing union organizer president of the largest country in Latin America, Brazil, took office, neither the president, nor the vice president, nor the secretary of state, not any prominent member of the U.S. cabinet went to the inauguration. So Latin America has been ignored, and if Latin America unites, that's going to be of some concern to the U.S. Now, I don't think that Latin America will unite. I don't think that it makes a lot of sense to unite, because we have these different Latin Americas, and we have to respect the fact that they are very different. As we saw in the recent World Cup, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Chile, they're all different countries. They play different styles, and I think that we have to celebrate diversity,
okay.
And I don't think that unity is going to happen anytime soon.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I thank you both, Sebastian Edwards and Oscar Guardiola-Rivera. Thank you very much for joining us.
A pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being with us too. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook, where you'll find previous episodes as well as information on upcoming programs. Be sure to post your questions and comments so we can post them to our guests. On the next show, war and peace. Is the presence of US troops around the world aimed at keeping the peace, or is it meant to expand the boundaries of what many call the American empire? Send us your thoughts on that, and be sure to tune in for the show. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.